you can think about the history of science, and this applies, I think, to any discipline, as the attempt to see how far you can go with a particular framework, a particular model, a particular metaphor, squeeze every last drop of goodness that you can get out of it, right? Eventually, we're going to need different sets of tools to look at the same phenomena. That is the molecular biology revolution. The idea of order from order in 1944 becomes what we all learn when we study molecular biology as the idea that organization comes from information. But if you're lucky, maybe once every 10 years, or maybe once in your life, you'll find something, you'll discover empirically something, or you'll come across a result, unexpected, groundbreaking, and the thrill of having that discovery is sufficient to feed you for the rest of your life of disappointments, of not discovering anything else.
This is Brain Inspired, powered by The Transmitter. That is Dan Nicholson, assistant professor of philosophy at George Mason University, here to talk about his little book, What is Life? Revisited. Erwin Schrödinger's What is Life is a famous little book that people point to as having predicted DNA, for example, a few other things that we discuss that have been a major influence. And it was a major influence and inspired many well-known biologists, ushering in the molecular biology revolution. But Schrödinger was a physicist, not a biologist, and he spent very little time and effort toward actually understanding biology. So what was he up to? Why did he write this quote-unquote famous little book? It turns out, as Dan writes about, Schrödinger had an agenda, a physics agenda. He wanted to save the older deterministic version of quantum physics from the new indeterministic version. When Dan was on the podcast a few years ago, we talked about the machine conception or view of biological systems, how everything these days has become a mechanism, and how that view fails to capture what modern science is actually telling us, that organisms are unlike machines in important and very specific ways. That work of Dan's led him down this path to Schrödinger's What is Life, which he argues was a major contributor to that machine metaphor so ubiquitous today in biology. One of the reasons I'm interested in this kind of work is because the cognitive sciences, including neuroscience and artificial intelligence, inherited this mechanistic perspective and swallowed it so hard that if you don't include the word mechanism in your research paper, you're vastly decreasing your chances of actually getting your work published. When in fact, the mechanistic perspective is one, albeit super useful, perspective among many. Anyway, we discuss all that and more. I link to all things Dan Nicholson in the show notes at braininspired.co/podcast/224. I want to say thank you to my Patreon supporters and to the Transmitter for their continued support of this podcast. The Complexity Science discussion group is going strong. I've been continuing to enjoy those discussions. We're going through the foundations of complexity science papers, which is a 4-volume thing from the Santa Fe Institute. Anyway, if you want to learn more about that and how to support the podcast and more of the bells and whistles that you get when you do that, go to braininspired.co. All right, enjoy Dan.
I think that if it is read in the way that I'm hoping it is read, that it will inspire people to do different things relating to it, right? I mean, the book is misleadingly narrow in its scope, in that it looks like it's just an analysis of one book, one little book on another little book, but actually it's an analysis of basically the last half a century of research in molecular and cell biology. And I'm just making a bunch of claims about why we ended up where we are now and where we might go in the future.
Yeah. Well, it's also sort of a book about physics as well, in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I mean, it's on the tail of, it's in line with like the rest of your work. It's like you've gone deeper and deeper and deeper, and like you ended up here at Schrödinger. And so what are you working on now, quickly? Maybe we can talk about that later too.
Well, I got a couple of things that I'm working on at the same time, but there is a direct follow-up to this little book, which is looking at the relationship between biology and physics more generally, and how that unfolded and developed over the 20th century. So the Schrödinger case is one case of how biologists and physicists spoke to each other and drew on each other's ideas during the 20th century. And it's really exciting because, physics undergoes this massive revolution at the beginning of the century, and then a bunch of biologists get excited about maybe instigating a similar revolution in biology based on the new physics. And then what ultimately happens is that when the revolution finally arrives in biology in the form of molecular biology, it's a revolution that is based on the old physics.
The old physics,
19th century Victorian deterministic, mechanistic physics with a little bit of cybernetics thrown in. So it's a sort of fascinating sort of dialectic between how we think about the relationship between biology and physics. So that's maybe the most direct sort of follow-up to this. But yeah, I mean, this book also provides the sort of foundation for why I had done that earlier work looking at the machine metaphor in cell biology and molecular biology. I mean, I was sort of looking for why we ended up where we are, and so that's why I was excited by this deep dive into the history.
And it's Schrodinger's fault.
I was suggesting, historians hate these sort of super simplistic generalizations.
Sure.
So I guess you can't really generalize like that, but maybe not entirely his fault, but I want to suggest that his influence has been sort of underappreciated. It was overappreciated for a while by biologists saying, Schrodinger's awesome and we want to be like Schrödinger, and so we want to do what Schrödinger did for physics. But the historians for about 30, 40 years have been basically saying that we shouldn't trust scientists when they say they were influenced by famous books. And so my book is a response to that consensus in the history of science, saying, you guys, you're right to point out that to some extent, right, the book was used politically for political purposes as a propagandistic tool to bring respect to the new field of molecular biology by associating with Schrödinger. But you've been wrong to dismiss the book as a scientific work. It wasn't just the name. I mean, he had an argument, and that argument, I suggest, actually influenced and shaped the way we think about the cell. So that's what I'm doing also in the book. I'm taking issue with everyone, but I'm on this part with the historians. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the word political there, and I don't think you use political. I'm not sure if you do in the actual book. And by the way, I love these elements. Cool. It's like reading a really long chapter.
Yeah.
Like they're short enough that like you can really consume it.
Yeah.
But man, you packed a lot of stuff in there. But yeah, I mean, it's great. I think maybe I just really enjoy your writing as well, so that helps. But because there's a clarity and just ease to it.
Yeah.
But I'm also really interested in the topic, so I'm not sure if it's a little bit muddled by that. But you used the word political just now, and I was going to ask you because one of the things that you discuss in the book, or that a conclusion almost that's recurrent through the book, is that Schrödinger, it turns out, like had an agenda, and it was almost he hated the new physics, and he desperately wanted the old physics to be true. And so in part, this book, What is Life, was his way of strong arming, maybe maybe that's a heavy term, but it was kind of a political move, right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's not that he hated the new physics. It's just that he thought that the new physics would not look as radically different from the old physics. So you can think of him as sort of a more on the conservative side. Maybe people have referred to him as the last sort of classical, the last old of the old generation, because he's not, he's younger than the Planck and others who, even though they were instigating that were also unhappy with the Copenhagen interpretation, but he's contemporary. He's around the same generation of people like Max Born and others who were quite keen to develop the new physics in this new direction. And so, you can think of what he's doing in this book as his protest, not just against the new physics, but more against the way the new physics was being used in this completely objectionable way, according to Schrödinger, which is to adopt certain positions in other areas, in biology and especially in psychology. I mean, I want to suggest that this was something I did not expect to find in my research. It was completely novel to me. that I became convinced by the weight of the evidence that I discovered in the archives that the book is basically the most important part of the book is the bit that everybody makes fun of, because it's
The epilogue.
the worst part, which is the epilogue, you know. So I was very surprised to find myself making that case. But
describe that. What does he do in the epilogue? Why do people make fun of it, and why does it seem out of place?
Yeah, because the epilogue is something that he added. It wasn't part of the original lectures, and so he added the epilogue when he wrote the manuscript. And the epilogue has nothing to do with the rest of the book. I mean, the title of the book is "What is Life," and then the subtitle is "The Physical Aspect of the Living Cell," which I think is the right. If you want to know what the book is about, that subtitle is more helpful than just "What is Life," because the book is not about defining life or the nature of life. It's about the physical aspect of the living cell. And yet the epilogue at the end is about free will and determinism. And it goes into Vedanta philosophy to make the case that this question of determinism and free will can't be resolved by physics. We need to draw on philosophy and ultimately, Eastern religion to solve it. And it's kind of hilarious because he added this in the manuscript, and he already had a contract with an Irish publisher, Cahill and Co. And the publisher received the manuscript, and when it got to the end, it was absolutely clear to the publisher that they were not going to publish the book
because it's so orthogonal to the rest of the.
Not just orthogonal, but it was offensive.
Yeah.
To Irish Catholic Ireland in 1944. So they said, unless you remove this, we're not going to publish the book. And actually, at that point, they had already sort of typeset in the book. It was all ready to go to the press. And Schrödinger was given that ultimatum, was given that choice, and Schrödinger decided, okay, no, well, refused. He refused, and so the publication didn't go ahead. And so he found himself in the situation where he had to find another publisher. He asked a friend of his, Donnan, who was actually an important figure also he shaped Schrödinger's views about the cell and about thermodynamics. And Donnan had already helped Born to publish a book with Cambridge University Press, or Cambridge University is a much better publisher than the original Irish one. And so that's what happened. So that led to a delay in publication as well, because Schrödinger insisted in keeping that little epilogue because he thought it was absolutely essential. And
why? Why did he think it was essential?
Because if I'm right, it's essential because there is where he's saying that, if it is the case that the cell is deterministic, then we can no longer jump from quantum mechanics to the brain, to the mind, because now, as Darlington put it, the organism now has a say in the matter, right? He's severing the link between the quantum world and the psychological world, where others had suggested, Bohr and especially Pascual Jordan, who was a student of or had worked with Bohr and Born, is one of the Göttingen people. When people developed matrix mechanics, not as well known because he then became a Nazi and his reputation was tarnished by this. But he got very excited by the idea that the indeterminacy that was suggested by Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics was amplified in the cell and was ultimately responsible for the creativity and the freedom that you find in organisms. And so that's
free will.
And so that's why Schrödinger writes that epilogue to say the consequence of what I presented in this book is that you can no longer make that move philosophically. And that's why he insisted on having that epilogue. Also, why he insisted in having it featured in the cover of the book. I also mentioned that's no longer appearing in new reprintings of the book. But Schrödinger insisted in having what is life, and then with an epilogue on determinism and free will. And it's kind of funny because you read all these reviews of the book by very senior scientists, and they're all excited. This is good stuff, and then they all make fun at the end of the epilogue.
Right.
Haldane says a mechanist has to provide a mechanistic account of the theory of mind or turn a somersault, he says. And in his epilogue, Schrödinger does the latter very elegantly.
Very elegantly, yeah. Yeah, that's you put that in the book. It's funny, at some point reading through your What is Life Revisited, I started picturing Schrödinger as this old school Saturday morning cartoon villain, with a sort of a quirky villain who's trying to meddle with things, and that's a very simplistic view. But it was also kind of helpful to frame what was going on. So I think that What is Life, Schrodinger's What is Life, is probably one of the most important books ever written. I haven't read it, but no, I'm just kidding. I have not read it, and I don't think it's one of the, based on your book, I actually have not read it, but based on your book, I don't think it's one of the most important, but it is super influential. And this is a big part of what you spend time on in the book is talking, you have direct quotes from so many molecular biologists and people in the biological fields who point to Schrödinger and who may or may not have read the book, but point to a few, I think it was like a list of three main things that people point to, right?
Yeah.
That have been a massive influence in their thinking. And the claim is that this is what Schrödinger's influence has been, right? On the field.
These 3 points are, the first one is that there is an aperiodic crystal, the hereditary substance. This is, of course, remember that Schrödinger is writing before even DNA was identified as the material carrier of heredity. Most people thought
genes were around, though.
Genes were around, of course.
Yeah.
But the demonstration that DNA was the carrier was published the same year as the Avery, as Schrödinger's book, and of course this is a decade before the double helix. And before information was being used in biology as well. So it comes before all of that. But he suggests that the best way, or the only plausible way to understand physically the hereditary substance is as an aperiodic crystal. Okay, and then, a lot of people have picked on that particular phrase, that contains within it a code script for development. And there is also the introduction of the term code. Technology, right? That's the first one. The second one is that...
Wait. Let's hang on there for just a second, because
absolutely.
There are two things. I mean, that is probably the main thing that I've heard is people pointing to Schrödinger as, well, he basically predicted DNA without there being any evidence for it. And lo and behold, it came true. Mm-hmm. And for this and for other things, like you just mentioned the code, code is not... He didn't mean it in the same way as the way we tend to mean code, right? He meant code as in a program, not a cipher. Can you unpack that? We're not going to go through every little detail in your book, but there are just a few things that I think are worth hanging on.
So a lot of people, with regards to the periodic crystal idea, he was very perceptive in suggesting, because of course he's like reasoning from the armchair here, that the only way to have stability, because the whole book really is an attempt by Schrödinger to resolve a paradox, which is how can something so small like genes be sufficiently stable to withstand the stochastic effects of Brownian motion, of thermal agitation? So that is the paradox that he tries to resolve in the book. And the way he does it is by suggesting that the structure of this hereditary material has to be a sort of crystal, because only crystals are sufficiently solid, he uses the word solid here, to withstand those effects, to be stable enough. But it can't just be any random crystal. It has to be aperiodic, he says, as opposed to periodic crystals, which are most of the crystals that chemists are familiar with, Schrödinger says. It has to be aperiodic so that it can contain within it the code script, right? So that there is, and all that, as I've just described it, can be construed as something that Schrödinger essentially got right? Because when DNA was... the structured DNA was identified. We can call it that. I mean, we can describe it as an aperiodic crystal. Then he said also that this crystal has this code script, right? And as you rightly point out, that has led to a lot of confusion because we use the word code in more than one way, right? So one very common interpretation of that idea is that Schrödinger anticipated the genetic code. Right. And the problem with that, and I'm not the first person to notice this, is that a genetic code is a cipher, which means that it requires, there needs to be some sort of correspondence rules between that allow you to go from one sequence to another sequence, right? In the case of the genetic code is you go from DNA bases to amino acids, right? And there's nothing like that in What is Life. There is no reference or implication that there are any correspondence rules. He's talking about the specification of the message that is going to be read during development, right? He He is arguing that the order of the organism is encoded in the DNA, but he's not saying that the DNA, that there's some sort of language that is transcribed and translated in the way that we think about genetic code. Instead, he's thinking more of a code as we talk today about a highway code or a code of conduct. So a set of rules that allow you to understand what you're supposed to do. And I think that's a much better way of thinking about what Schrödinger is up to when he talks about a code script. And actually it's what leads to then the notion of a genetic program, coined independently by Ernst Mayr and Jacob and Monod at the same time, same year in 1961, 17 years later, ends up having as much of an influence as the idea of a genetic code, as a metaphor for development, for what happens in development, which is, the execution, programmatic execution of a set of algorithmic instructions encoded in the genome. And I think what I suggest in the book is that that's a much better way of thinking about Schrödinger's legacy here. That he made it legitimate to think about development in this way as being preformed deterministically, preformationistically as well, and also in a way that allows you to think about computability. He even mentions Laplace, the Laplace's demon, in the book, saying, if you have access, if you can read this code script, you can compute the embryo, which incidentally is what then developmental geneticists start saying in the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah.
Right. Which is a very interesting connection. So that's what I suggest with the idea of a code script, that it needs to be understood in the right way to understand his influence.
And then you take some pains to say that is so development can't be thought of in terms of a preformation. You don't specify all of development because there is a lot of randomness and stochasticity during development. And I mean, maybe we can get later into the concept of organization as being important in its own right, self-organization and organization as a principle, that these things aren't predetermined.
No.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
Going back to so we'll get on to the other 2 points, but to linger here a little bit longer. There's the whole order from disorder and order from order principles.
Yeah.
And so what Schrödinger claims to want to do here is to say that life is order from order, being the crystalline structure, the crystal-like structure, whereas physics at the time, and maybe what he railed against or preferred not to accept, or I don't know how to phrase it, physics at the time, statistical mechanics, showed that you can get order from disorder. Yes. So the statistical properties of large collections of entities like atoms can give rise to ordered, you can say things about their mean and emergent properties of those statistical properties, the collection of statistical properties. You can say things about the whole in an ordered fashion, even though at the smallest scale, they're disordered. And what you had alluded to earlier is that Schrödinger was looking for this thing, and he said, the genetic material has to be so small that doesn't apply. So therefore, like statistical mechanics, large collections of things don't apply because it's so small. It's going to be affected by the thermodynamics at that scale, and so it has to be this crystalline structure.
Yeah,
right.
That's the puzzle. Like he says, as a physicist, this makes no sense. This should not be.
Right.
And so that's why he comes up with this idea of an aperiodic crystal, which is sort of maintained by these solidifying forces. And here he draws on the Heitler-London theory of the covalent bond. So he's using the new quantum mechanics to provide determinacy, which is kind of ironic because today we think of quantum mechanics as providing the opposite. But he thought that the new quantum mechanics would provide a basis for the determinacy of life, as opposed to the indeterminacy of life, which is how many others, led by Bohr, interpreted the implication of quantum mechanics for biology. So you have like a sort of a discussion about the legacy or how we should think about the impact of quantum mechanics on biology. And Schrödinger here is on his own almost, like he's fighting against this consensus view that quantum mechanics throws a spanner in the works by suggesting that there may be more indeterminacy that biologists are more comfortable with. And he wants to say, no. Actually, genetics gives us good reasons to think that quantum mechanics can explain the determinacy, which is required by the fact that genes are responsible for the phenotype. I mean, he is having to rely on a very genocentric view of life and a very deterministic view of how genes work, and essentialistic, to make this picture work. Okay, so it's all very construed in a way so that he can say what he wants to say, which is, don't listen to physicists when they tell you about the impact of quantum mechanics on biology and psychology, because I'm showing in this book that no matter what happens in these discussions about quantum mechanics, the cell is a deterministic entity, development is a deterministic process, and so you can't go there from physics to psychology, to the brain, to make the case for free will. That's basically what he's trying to do in the book.
Yeah, so there's this quote from the book from Paul Ewald.
Yeah.
Schrödinger appeared not to be interested in a thorough survey of the literature in biology, but rather wanted to know of a few articles that would corroborate his point of view. This is like not the way that you're supposed to do science. But I mean, at the same time, you kind of talk about how this was almost a side project for him to put a stamp on the thing and then move on.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people have wanted to believe that he was invested in the fate of biology, and he just wasn't. This was a hobby for him to get into, think about the implications of these ideas in biology. In fact, I also have a footnote where Warren Weaver, who's this physicist who then became super important for molecular biology because he was responsible for financing. He was financing much of the work that led to molecular biology. He was head of the sort of Rockefeller Foundation. So a lot of the money that went into the work that led to molecular biology was funded by this guy. And he was very excited about Schrödinger's argument. And so he came to Dublin in 1950 to meet with Schrödinger, to find out, expecting that Schrödinger would be quite happy to receive money so that he could continue to work on this, on how, theoretical physics can illuminate our problems in biology. And Schrödinger just said, look, I'm done. I've moved on. I have nothing else to say. So
he solved it.
He solved it, and he moved on to something else. And so this is why, arguably, I think he did not reply to Crick. So Francis Crick, just when he publishes with Watson the two papers in Nature that change biology in 1953, quickly writes a letter to Schrödinger and says, "Hey, dear Professor Schrödinger, I just want you to know that Watson and I were really inspired by your book, and you have a look at these papers because they will show to you, I hope, that your idea of an aperiodic crystal is going to be very important for the future of biology." And then Schrödinger does not reply.
Crickets.
And I think that's because he had moved on. I mean, he was doing all kinds of different projects. I mean, as part of his job as the director of the Division of Theoretical Physics of the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, the part of the job entailed him giving a set of annual public lectures on different topics, right? And so he gave a bunch of lectures series on a wide range of topics, on ancient Greece, on the mind. He's got one, Mind and Matter. He's got another one on sort of questions in the philosophy of science. So this was just one of the many sort of little projects that he engaged in. But it was an important project to him. As I explain in the book, he had been thinking about this for a decade before the lectures. I mean, in the early 30s. And I show that the archives give us good reasons to conclude that he got interested precisely because he found his colleagues making these incursions into biology in a way that he found extremely offensive and objectionable. So there's good evidence that the whole reason why a decade before those lectures, he decided he was going to ultimately work on this was because he wanted to have something to say to his physicist colleagues about how one should think about the physics-biology relationship. How legitimate is it for you to project onto biology the sort of ideas that have taken hold of your area of your field of physics?
That's an interesting thing, and maybe we can discuss this later. But I've been thinking about that in the neurosciences and in artificial intelligence research. I mean, I've had a lot of people on this podcast. A lot of people in neuroscience come from the physics world,
right?
And it's almost like, oh, come on, can it not be all physicists? Can they not solve everything in other fields? Or you never see like a biologist go into physics, right? You always see physicists go into other fields, and it seems to be a one-way street. And I find that disappointing somehow. Mm-hmm. Although they have like great tools for thinking about things. And in this case, it was Schrödinger, you said, on his own kind of. So in a sense, the rest of the physicists were making incursions into biology were sort of on maybe what you would consider to be a more right track? Would that be a way to put it?
It really depends from what perspective we evaluate these things, so historically we need to be careful here. So I think for much of the second half of the 20th century, we would have had to conclude that Schrödinger was on the right track because molecular biologists have shown no interest and there's no appetite to consider the effects of quantum phenomena on molecular processes.
But I don't care about what people are interested in.
Okay.
I care about what's accurate.
Well,
right?
Just to clarify, what's accurate changes. I mean, what we think is accurate changes over time.
Right.
I mean, now there's more of an appetite to take these things seriously. So people.
But what we think is accurate is influenced by who says it.
Yeah.
And in this case, Schrödinger, and you point to the fact that a lot of molecular biologists point to Schrödinger to sort of bolster their case, right?
Yes.
So, and that happens I don't know, that sort of stuff, it bothers me all the time in every field, my field included. You just name drop and then it gives more credence to whatever you say then.
Right.
And it shouldn't be that way.
Absolutely. And I think that's what the historians starting in the 1980s started pointing out. Let's not overstate the case. These people were interested in just name dropping Schrödinger. And they did so, interestingly, quite late in the day. And when they start, getting Nobel Prizes, that's when you find Maurice Wilkins is the first one to do this in 1962, and then others follow a few years later. That's when they start saying, I was very inspired by the great physicist Schrödinger, who had written this little book. And so, you're right. And I think that's what the historians were pointing to, that it's not enough just for you to name drop and to assume that the authority of someone who's made an important contribution to one field justifies what you're doing, even though that's arguably what happened, right? Molecular biology dissociated itself from biochemistry and the earlier biological traditions because it was in some way different, right? It did not concern itself with the messy biochemical details of metabolism. Instead, it had a vision of information. And so the questions are totally different. They're not questions about energy. They're questions about information. Even matter is sort of not that important anymore. The stuff of the embryo doesn't matter. What's important is you've got a message that needs to be effectively transcribed and translated. And it's all. So you've got a very, very different picture. And I think that there's some truth to that this was something that was done. And what I'm sort of swimming against the flow there as well in my book, because I'm saying that Schrödinger's argument itself was influential. It wasn't just that he was a very, very famous physicist, but what he had to say provided us a vision, a way of doing your work as a molecular biologist, and it told you what to expect to find, which was sort of this clockwork determinacy at the heart of the cell. And I think one can make a good case that that's exactly what they found. And so in that sense, Schrödinger was successful. That's why I was asking you, how do we decide who's right here? Well, I mean, for a long time, people would have been quite happy to say, this is a good reconstruction, Nicholson, and Schrödinger was right, But what I find interesting is in the last 20, 25 years, science never stops. There are new methods that allow us to look at things in a new way, and we're discovering new things. And what's interesting to me is that now we are in a situation where there's a lot of evidence to want us to challenge that view that had been dominant for half a century. And so then the whole picture acquires a new significance, because now it's not about how we got to the right picture. It's like how we ended up being so misguided about how proteins, work and all of that, right? So it's still important, but for a different reason.
But you just said the truth changes, or our understanding of what is accurate changes.
Yes.
And, so to say, well, now we've got it right for now, what we think. And I want to come back to that. But one of the reasons why I find what you do so valuable, and I guess the history and philosophy of science so valuable, is that we get these stories passed down to us. And they're like legends, right? There's like this whole Schrödinger thing, like, well, Schrödinger did this. Yeah. And when you go to the archives, dust off the books, look through the people's letters to each other, then you elucidate, like, even when these Nobel laureates cite Schrödinger and say he was very influential, often you point out in the book, the thing that people cite, they actually have a misconception about what he was doing frequently, or what the claim actually was in his book, right? So they're taking their own sheen on what they understand it in their own modern context, importing that to what Schrödinger said. And when you dig into like the language used, the things that were expressed, the things that were known at the time, that were understood at the time, and the things that weren't understood at the time, like your work on just use of the term code, right? If we just take it for whatever, you can take whichever meaning you want these days and just apply it and say, oh, okay, well, I was influenced by that. But when you dig into how he was using it, I mean, these details kind of matter. And I just find that a very valuable exercise that you and your ilk do. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a tension. I want to sort of pose a problem for my own position here, which is that just following from what you just said now, if it really is the case that people read him in a way that misconstrued what he was saying, then how can I make the case that that it was influential, right? And so the way to resolve that, which is a legitimate concern one may have about what I'm doing, is that not everybody misconstrued what Schrödinger was doing. So if you look at what the work, rather than what they said, but rather what they did, you find the influence of the ideas. I actually also did a little bit of a deep dive into one particular figure, Jacques Monod, very influential French molecular biologist and promoter of the view of the cell. He's got this super famous book, Chance and Necessity. And if you look at his particular intellectual development, you'll find that he was influenced by Schrödinger. He didn't say so, but in his unpublished lectures, he mentions how Schrödinger sort of something clicked in his mind, that he understood that what we needed in biology are not statistical explanations, but mechanical explanations, right? The regularities that are going to matter are not the kind of regularities that you find in statistical mechanics. They're going to be the ones that you find in engineering, the ones that machines embody. So you can see that influence. But then, I'm thinking more of the commentators. This book has been, cited to death. There's like a million papers, short little things, talking about how wonderful the book was. And those, I went through all of them because I got this compulsive.
You're not even eye rolling right now.
I want to be careful. I went through everything, and I find, that ad nauseum, what happens is everyone mentions ultimately these three things that I mentioned in the book, right? And so that's that's not, I say, a fair account. So the book is much more interesting than just those three things. That's why I set that up at the beginning of my book and say, look, you may know just those three things. I'm going to show you in the book that the book is much. Schrödinger's main claim is not captured by those three things,
right?
And that the influence has been much greater, paradoxically, than if it had just been those three things. In the sense that he gave us a vision of what the cell is like and how the cell operates, a vision that is still with us today, a vision that sets the sort of the standards of legitimacy that we take as the burden is on you if you want to challenge that vision. Right.
And what is that vision? What is that vision again?
The cell is a machine. The cell is a piece of clockwork that is deterministically controlled by its genes, where all of the parts sort of behave in a mechanical way, and it's all about the action of individual molecules. And what we need to care about is the structure of these molecules, because the structure is rigid and the way they function is specifically. So it's all about how the structure determines function, and that's basically the agenda of sort of protein science for the second half of the 20th century. That's why people think of, one reason why people think about proteins in the way that they do for so long. And they don't think in terms of these sort of fluid macromolecules as we are now beginning to think about proteins, as intrinsically disordered, as being almost liquid-like, as doing different things in different contexts depending on what substrate they're able to bind to. Right.
Very statistical, very stochastic, very dependent on context.
Yeah, exactly. Dependent on context. And the irony, Paul, is that is what a physicist would be able to tell you.
Most physicists.
Someone who knows nothing about biology. You approach them and you say, hey, can you explain to me? So at this particular physical scale, how would you expect molecular interactions to take place? The likely answer that you're going to get is one which factors in the stochasticity. And that's what you don't get when you look at, at least these textbook descriptions about how molecules interact. So that's the ultimate irony for me, that it's a physicist that is responsible for making a whole generation of molecular biologists forget about the effects of physics on the things that they work on.
So the idea of, okay, here's a phrase: genes don't determine biological organization. Or let's say DNA doesn't determine biological organization. You're on board with that, right?
Yeah, I think that the best way to think about it, if we're going to have to use some metaphor from engineering or whatever, then I think it's better to think of DNA as a database than as a program. That there's information of some kind. I think it should not be disputed. I mean, there is a way of getting to the primary structure of proteins from the sequence of DNA. I mean, that's just a fact, an empirical fact, right? But to go from the amino acid sequence of a peptide chain to function, let alone what the cell does, let alone what happens in development, that's where the error is. But that the idea that there is information in DNA and that there is that, I don't think that there's anything wrong with. I mean, I don't think, empirically speaking, I mean, you say I have an agenda, I do, but my metaphysical agenda is informed by the science, Paul. So I mean, I try to go where the science leads me, and I think, and the science leads me to a processual view, but it's grounded in what I think are the empirical findings. What we've learned from looking at these things for decades, right? The best way to think about what happens in the cell or development, about organisms, is in terms of stabilized processes, not as fixed substance or fixed things. That's a much better way, even though it's counterintuitive. I think it's a better way of understanding and thinking about what's going on. Right? Everything is dynamic. That's the default. Dynamicity, change, right? And so we need to work out why things appear stable, which is what you asked me before, right? Why is it that things seem stable if it really is the case that everything is dynamic?
So going back to this phrase, I mean, I wrote it down, so I'm reading it here. Genes don't determine biological organization, which is what you were just speaking to.
They don't. They provide a resource, but they don't determine the organization. That's right.
Is there something genes do determine? Like, what could we say they do
determine? Primary sequence of amino acids, the primary structure of proteins. I mean, that was known in 1957 when Crick has this, he calls it the sequence hypothesis, and says, they had the sequence of DNA is likely to be the template for RNA, and the RNA is likely to be the template for protein. That was right. That's correct. So they determined that.
But that is not the nexus of how we should understand what life is.
It's not enough to understand function, to understand organization, and not even enough to understand what proteins are doing. Like if you have the sequence of the amino acids that make up the proteins, sort of the building blocks, you still don't really know what a protein is doing at a given time, right? And so that's where we fill in the gaps of our knowledge with our own ideologies, right? And so if you think of the system as a clockwork machine, then you say, well, okay, it probably is a molecular machine. And so as a molecular machine, once it's got a structure, it has the structure is what determines what the operation of the machine. And it does so in a regular way that you can predict, in a deterministic way. And so you fill that picture up with what you want to be true.
Right.
What I'm saying is that Schrödinger provides, that picture. It's not the only one, but he gives us an account based on physics for why that picture is reasonable and plausible. The picture of clockwork, fixity, and rigidity, so that molecular biologists cannot have to worry about what, how to interpret this stuff. They can just go to the races and say, yeah, well, that's clearly what's going on here.
Yeah. In fact, you can't, I'm thinking of Stuart Kaufman's notion of the adjacent possible. You actually can't know what a protein will do based on its sequence, because as you were talking about, in a different context, in a different environment, it can do different things. Also, within the context of the cell, it does do different things. Yeah. And stochastically is switching back and forth between different conformations. And if it's available in this conformation, it can do this for a few nanoseconds and then it goes back. So it's very, very fluid and stochastic.
Yeah. I mean, and I also want to suggest that that stuff that you just said is surprising to us Not because it's surprising, because it had to be surprising, but because the view that most people have isn't that one, right? So the reason why that strikes us as novel and weird and exciting is because we have been trained to think about those processes in a different way. That's why I was saying that a physicist that hasn't been sort of contaminated or brainwashed by those ideas may find it perfectly reasonable to say that, proteins are going to stochastically switch between conformations, because that's what the physics tells you. The physics of the situation, it tells you that that's the more likely way in which this molecule is likely to behave. Right?
Okay, so we haven't touched on the other. Let's also just talk about the other two things that people point to as in terms of Schrödinger's big influence on the field.
Yeah, so the second one is the idea that organisms conform to the second law of thermodynamics by feeding on negative entropy, right? And that was picked up, and a lot of people remember Schrödinger's book primarily for that reason. So it's an attempt to reconcile life with the second law of thermodynamics. How can life exist if entropy is continually increasing in the universe according to the second law of thermodynamics? How can you have systems, physical bodies that don't degrade in that way? And so what Schrödinger suggests is that organisms are sort of feeding on what he calls negative entropy, free energy, and that energy is being used in metabolism to regenerate the system, to reconstitute it, materially speaking. And this claim, I think, is just it's so weird that is something that is almost always mentioned, because if you actually look at the book, at What is Life, it's only like 6 pages on that. It's like not only that, but it's kind of a side comment. Like he takes a breather in the penultimate chapter. Oh, he's going to talk for a moment. Forget everything I've been talking. He actually says, forget about genes and chromosomes. Let's just think about thermodynamics for a moment. And so he gives us this very elegant discussion about negative entropy, and that's it. And so people have really made a big deal out of it. I mean, in fact, I say in my book that people who really like non-equilibrium thermodynamics and self-organization have taken Schrödinger to be some sort of apostle, some great figure that is the first person to look with vision to a biology that will be completely founded on non-equilibrium thermodynamics, and that's just false, because that's not what he wants to say, and I actually have a bunch of quotes from people who want him to say that, and I deconstruct them and say, this is not this is historically really inaccurate. Schrödinger isn't the first person to deal with these issues. There's nothing really original in what he's saying, although he says it in a very elegant way that became influential. And he's not saying what you want him to be saying. You want him to say that the order of life is based on self-organization, and he's deliberately saying the opposite of that the order of life is based on genes. Yeah, so I think that's, and in a way I also say that ironically, when I told you that the historians were complaining that the biologists were using Schrödinger's name to bring respectability on molecular biology. That's, I think, what happened with the non-equilibrium thermodynamics people. They used Schrödinger's name to bring respectability on this new field of physics applied to biology, and that case is a much more troubling one, because they're really distorting what Schrödinger is actually saying in the book. Literally putting words in his mouth that are not things that he said, and not things that he would have said, because he doesn't talk about self-organization in the book. He doesn't talk about open systems. He doesn't talk about far from equilibrium conditions. He's simply making the point that there's no reason to suppose that that organisms can't comply with the second law, and that point had been made by biochemists and physical chemists years before, including this guy Donnan, who we mentioned earlier in our conversation. Donnan, the guy who negotiated with Cambridge University Press for the publication of the book. He was a physical chemist. He wrote a couple of papers that influenced Schrödinger. One of them was making this case. And so I have a quote from that paper by Donnan from 1928, basically saying the same thing that Schrödinger then says in 1944 that everyone remembers, right? Yeah. So there's not much novelty in that, although it seems to be indisputable that people were influenced by that. I mean, Kaufman, Terry Deacon, Freeman Dyson, really prominent theoreticians
Yeah.
were influenced by that idea, even though Schrödinger himself would not have been happy to see his his book being used to make a case which is very different from the case that he's making. That's another reason why the book has been so misconstrued. I mean, the book is an apology for the most rigid, deterministic, mechanistic, reductionistic, genocentric view of molecular biology that you can imagine, right? And yet it has many lives. And one of the lives that it has today is as a defense of far from equilibrium thermodynamics,
Yeah.
Really
it's whatever people want it to be.
Yeah, like the Bible, you
Right.
read, you find whatever you want in it. You look at the book with your ideology, as you say, your agenda, and you find whatever you need to make your case stronger.
Come on, Dan. The Bible's true. We know that. Okay. What is original in the book? The aperiodic crystal, which we've
the aperiodic crystal is original. I mean, the distinction between order from order and order from disorder is a very nice way of thinking about organization and order, right? Should we think about order statistically in terms of the regularities that emerge when you consider large numbers, or should we consider regularity in terms of the structure of individual entities? That contrast, I think, it's not necessarily new. In fact, he cites a paper by Planck. Planck distinguished between dynamical laws and statistical laws in physics. That distinction is this distinction. Dynamical laws like Newton's law of gravity is dynamical, but most laws tend to be statistical. Laws of kinetics also statistical in the sense that the regularity and reliability of them only emerges when you consider large numbers. And so that contrast is, I think, really influential. And also it's the way people like Monod understand the difference between biochemistry and molecular biology. It's that, Paul. Monod's going to want to tell you that what makes us different as molecular biologists from these older people is that they think it's all about statistics ultimately, and stochasticity and dynamics and kinetics, and we think it's about information encoded in individual molecules, and it's all about structure and rigidity and specificity, and that's the new paradigm, right? And I think that contrast that is in the book, I think is I don't know if it's completely new, but I think it's a really important part of what Schrödinger is doing there. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, I don't think it matters that much what is completely new and what is not. It's like how he, what he does with the ideas that are around. I mean, I take great pains to show that what he has to say about genes is influenced by geneticists like Muller, who's an arch reductionist, makes Richard Dawkins look like a holist by comparison, writing already in the 1920s about how the gene is the basis of life. And those are the views which are not dominant in genetics at the time that Schrödinger picks, because those are the views that allows him to say what he wants to say, which is that the organism and development is all determined by the genes. And that's this determinacy that is not not affected by quantum effects or anything like that. There's no such thing as indeterminacy. That's all is irrelevant. All this stuff is irrelevant to understanding biology. And what we expect, he says, to find in biology is more of that. I mean, in fact, we can get that takes us to the third in the list.
I was about to ask.
So
I couldn't remember if we've already said it.
It's like, we should expect new laws of physics to emerge.
Right.
In studying the cell, we should expect to uncover new laws of physics. Again, this has been widely misconstrued. There's a lot we could say. I don't want to get into the weeds there, but just to briefly say, Delbruck was inspired by Bohr and did think that the development of looking more and more carefully into the hereditary mechanism would lead to a paradox. He was looking for a paradox which was equivalent to the paradox that had led to quantum mechanics in physics. And that was never found, of course, because, DNA, the mechanism of replication of DNA did not require any new physics. But some people have assumed, because Schrödinger talks so much about Delbruck in the book, because he talks about this paper that he wrote in 1935, they've just assumed that the idea of new laws of physics is the same as the idea of the paradox, which suggests that Schrödinger actually is an anti-reductionist. He's all about indeterminacy, and that's lend itself to that interpretation. But when you read the book, again, if you actually take the time to read this little book, you discover that what he means by new laws of physics are laws, order from order laws, right? Laws that explain how it is that order is effectively, successfully amplified, right, from the genes to the organism. And so how should we interpret that idea from today's perspective? Well, the idea of a genetic program, the idea of the central dogma, ideas of informational and structural specificity could all maybe qualify as what Schrödinger thought we would find. And if we think about it that way, then his program was successful. I mean, he made a prediction, it turned out to be true. We did find these order from order mechanisms and principles that allow us to understand why the cell does what it does. Now things are beginning to crumble, right? That's, again, we go back to how the excitement of new science. But yeah, if we were having this conversation in 1990, my conclusion would have to be, Schrödinger got it right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so you just said that if you actually read the book, you find out that, you have a different interpretation. Yeah. But can you, or do you have to be a Dan Nicholson and read correspondences and go back? Like, how much sleuthing do you have to do? I mean, is it available in the book, or do you really need like the historical context?
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's fair. Probably you need to do something more than the book. And in fact, the book is not, it's not, the arguments are not presented in a very clear way. They're presented in a very roundabout way. And Schrödinger apologizes to the reader, says, look, I'm doing
this is a side project here.
I'm doing it this way. And he says, I'm doing it this way because that's how what I'm going to present to you follows how I learned about it.
Yeah. I like that though.
Yeah.
In principle.
So that's why he says, the book is about order, right? So the first chapter is, so the question is, what is the source of biological order? It's not what is life. That is his question. What is the source of biological order? Chapter 1. Okay, if you're a physicist, what do you know about order? And so you've got a whole chapter on statistical mechanics. That's the first chapter of the book, order from disorder. That's what physicists understand by order. Chapter 2, hey, the new genetics seems to suggest that there's something wrong here because everything seems to be determined by genes. So everything that a physicist knows is not sufficient to understand what's going on in biology. That's chapter 2. And so he then says, well, how do we resolve this paradox? And that's where he talks about the code script and the aperiodic crystal. So I have a whole chapter in my book just reconstructing the argument as clearly as I can so that the reader can understand what the argument, how it works, right? And what follows from it. But you're right, Paul. Maybe it is the case that it's not enough just to read it. It doesn't, I mean, it's a kind of book that it's sufficiently ambiguously written that you can just interpret in different ways. Yeah.
Oh, this goes to the notion of motif, which I just had Vicente Raja on, and he's developing this notion of a motif in the sciences. So what I was going to say earlier is like, yeah, it's been massively influential, even though people misconstrue the intentions or, what is actually being said often. And yet progress continues. Even if people are wrong about how they're influenced by Schrödinger, science marches on. It doesn't matter how you're influenced. If you're doing the research, new answers will come. A moment ago, you just mentioned things are crumbling now, so I want to get back to that. But anyway, Vicente's concept of motif is based around like, how do like so many different scientists in the same field use the same term, but actually mean different things when they use the term.
Yeah.
And yet, they can all use that term. Well, for Vicente, he's like, okay, well, I'm going to call this a motif and just say like, it's okay because we can kind of mean the same thing. And as long as we kind of mean the same thing, we can still make progress as a field. And so he kind of welcomes that, as opposed to the philosophers' default of nitpicking definitions.
Yeah,
right?
Maybe I'm a bit less optimistic than Vicente about that, in the sense that I think that this is the source of a lot of confusion. I mean, information is the word that comes to my mind when you talk the way you do.
Well, let's dig a little bit deeper in that, because you say that this book is also really what leads to everything is information, the modern notion of everything being information.
Yeah, it helps. I want to be careful about how extreme I make the claims, but it consolidates particular views. It justifies and legitimizes particular views pertaining to the importance of information. Yes. Yeah. Basically, the bottom line, the headline, whatever, is order from order becomes organization from information. That is the molecular biology revolution. The idea of order from order in 1944 becomes what we all learn when we study molecular biology as the idea that organization comes from information. That's I would argue, a Schrödingerian inference.
And so, I'm interested in these topics because just a, simple neuroscientist person. And reading your work and so many others in the philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, you realize that the molecular revolution introduced these ideas into neuroscience, into the way that we think about how brains function. I mean, it's like a direct line. Yes. And I would have to do some archival sleuthing like you do to tease that out. Yeah. And in fact, but when I get my own lab, I'm going to have a cross-disciplinary lab. I'll ensure to hire you on some sort of external. Maybe you can hire me. You're ahead of me in the academia world, anyway. But it would take that, and so that's part of why I enjoy talking to you. Is in my own mind, I wonder where these concepts come from, and I think you can draw a direct line from Schrödinger, like through molecular biology, to the use of information as a tool and a concept in the neurosciences.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the obviously, right, there are going to be the kinds of processes that you care about as a neuroscientist have a molecular basis, cellular basis, right? Many.
It's all in cells and neurons,
and so then it's going to have to influence it, right? So how we think about neurological process is going to be influenced by what we take to be true at the cellular level or molecular level. So yeah, I think that's right.
But as far as things crumbling these days, from that point of view, I'm not sure what the state is in molecular biology. I mean, you began in molecular biology, right? Before you saw the light and went into philosophy and historical philosophy. And in a sense, in neuroscience, there's a lot of questioning of those sort of fundamental principles as well, or assumptions, the mechanistic view. Although the mainstream is still like, if you don't use the word mechanism in your abstract, you might not be published. It's
the same molecular biology, by the way. So
it still is the same.
I'm not, crumbling maybe is a bit too optimistic, but I think we're headed in that direction. But no, I think what you said applies also to molecular biology. The dominant view still is
What's the direction that we're headed?
A direction, well, what I presented in this is the Cell Relay Machine paper, a direction where the way we think about what goes on at the molecular level and at the cellular level is being challenged, like explicitly and directly, frontally challenged by empirical results. So the challenge is not conceptual in the first case. It's because we have new methods and new techniques that we're learning new things about the stuff that we study. And those empirical discoveries are then encouraging scientists to be a bit less timid about challenging the orthodoxy here. But it's being methodologically driven, which is kind of cool because the concepts are old, I also said this in that paper, that you can track those criticisms sometimes decades, but it's only now becoming important because only now we have the evidence, and the scientists care about evidence. They're not philosophers. An idea is not sufficient to get an idea that is cool. You need to have the evidence to back it up, and only now we have the evidence to back it up. So that's why only now is taken seriously. We can't ignore what we're now learning about how proteins interact. We talked about that a moment ago. We can't ignore what we're learning about gene expression and what we're learning about development and differentiation. And so, that's what is happening now. And that's why I think that we're headed in that direction, a direction where we take less for granted the notion that everything is information. And we bring back to the picture the materiality of life. Life is embodied in matter, and the physical properties of matter are going to matter as much, if not more, than the message encoded in the genes to understand why cells and why development operates, proceeds the way that it does.
But you are a card-carrying pluralist. What's wrong with using concepts like information or mechanism, as a useful metaphor, a useful model? I mean, the map is not the territory, although I think that's what Whitehead's the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, I think it's called, right? Where you substitute the map for the territory, or the territory, the map for the territory. But I mean, if we need multiple perspectives to understand things, and all models are wrong, some are useful. Man, I just spouted off like the greatest hits of those like phrases. I'm sorry.
Part of it's like embedded into your psyche.
Well, you told I saw you give a talk and talk about John Dupre's influence on you, and you had mentioned that when you guys had like these meetings, and John would never write anything down, and he told you that if you spend enough time thinking about these things, they'll kind of solidify in your mind. You don't need to write them down. I guess that's sort of what's happening. On the other hand, maybe I'm doing some like name dropping, some like quote dropping shit. That's not,
I was completely like shocked that John was like just listening to these hour-long discussions every week, and I was like frantically making notes, page after page, and John didn't need to, and then he would write something, just sit. I mean, I can't do that. I just don't have.
Well, he's also at a
power to just sit down in front of a blank page, Paul, and then write and all the stuff that has been fermenting in your mind. It's all like I can't do. I have to like write things down, think about them. I don't
outline things and stuff. Is that how he does it? Is it just comes out when it's ready?
I believe so. I believe so. Huh. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of how we talk.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, yes, you just saw a prime example. I'm just like John Dupre, right? It just. but what is like,
yeah,
can't we hang on to information as a metaphor?
No,
totally fine. It's just not ontologically the thing. Is that the
well, I mean, no, the idea is actually quite more subtle than it may seem. In fact, I think that we can't do science without metaphors. The idea of distinguishing metaphorical from literal, to abandon that. Everything is ultimately metaphorical, and metaphors are super valuable and useful.
Everything except the thing itself, right? That you're studying, like the meat. That's the real thing.
Yeah, but we conceptualize that meat, that real thing, in ways that we're blurring.
It has to be
that, like even the very concepts that we use, blur that. So it's a very sort of complex process, and scientific discovery and learning about discovering new phenomena, and then finding a way to talk about the new stuff. So it just comes handy. It's kind of handy to see something through the prism of something else that you are more familiar with, because that gives you a handle on this new thing. But the problem is that because no two things are the same, there are always going to be things that are not captured in that redescription, and those are sort of put to the background, and only the things that are similar are foregrounded. And so when those metaphorical redescriptions are very successful, we forget that we're dealing with metaphors, and it becomes the territory, as you say. So that's the problem. And also the machine metaphor and information talk and all of these things have been extremely valuable in allowing us to learn about the phenomena that we're interested in, and
they're necessary.
Sorry?
They're necessary, so of course they're valuable.
Yeah, but even when they fail, they're valuable, because when they fail, we learn about what this phenomenon is not like, right? So if the cell is not like a machine, we've learned what the cell is like, and namely, it's not like a machine. So it's all positive, right? We're still learning, and and there'll be, as I say in my paper, there are aspects of cellular behavior and structure that can be understood as a machine. It's never black or white. It's not binary here. Some, the ATP synthase rotary motor, it looks like a motor. There's nothing wrong with thinking about it in those terms. Just don't let yourself get carried away in thinking that just because you got this shiny thing that works, that you can illuminate everything with that very same conceptual resource. So the way you can think about it, if you want to be a pluralist, as you say, is history is exploring how far you can take certain metaphors, right? Second half of the 20th century is the exploration of how far we can take certain metaphors about protein structure, protein function. We are now at a moment where perhaps those metaphors are changing, or the alternative ones are becoming more influential. And so we will explore how far those can take us. So one way to think about it, I don't know if you said I'm a card-carrying pluralist. I'm not sure if I am. But if you were really a pluralist and you make no commitments, and you don't want to say anything about truth or reality.
That's not what a pluralist is it?
Huh?
No, I don't think that's what
if you're
pluralism
an pluralist. If you're an ontological pluralist, that's what it would mean to say.
But no, pluralism doesn't mean anything goes, right?
It can mean, depending on what kind of pluralism we're talking about. You can be a methodological pluralist where you say I completely, subscribe to that idea. We need different ways of looking at something, but there is a thing underlying, reality that we try to uncover. I don't want to say that we need to throw truth out of the window just because we may not be able to access it, but it's still there. It's not constructed, right? So there are many different positions one can take here. I'm not saying that you're taking any here, but as far as I'm concerned, you can think about the history of science, and this applies, I think, to any discipline, as the attempt to see how far you can go with a particular framework, a particular model, a particular metaphor, squeeze every last drop of goodness that you can get out of it, right? And then eventually, right, if you're a Kuhnian, you think the paradigm eventually gets into a crisis and we need a different, but eventually we're going to need different sets of tools to look at the same phenomena. And we will probably discover things maybe that we always knew, but we never took seriously because the metaphors that were dominant suggested that we shouldn't need to take these things seriously. I mean, no molecular biologist is ignorant of stochasticity. It's just not taken very seriously. No evolutionary biologist is ignorant of constraints in development, but it's not taken seriously if you're an adaptationist. So depending on the area, there's certain, everyone purports to be a pluralist, but then when it gets serious, people end up gravitating towards their preferred explanations for things.
Well, okay, but everything flows, right? Yeah. So, like the concept of mechanism, right? So we're going to come back to Vicente's concept of motif, but like the new mechanists. I know you sort of didn't want to, right? But then you had to study mechanism a lot for your PhD, because that's a long road. But it seems like the goalposts move from, well, okay, so here's what a mechanism is. 10 years later, well, actually, all right, so here's what a mechanism is now, where it has some different features. Where I know that the concept of mechanism has changed and sort of tried to. My point is that historically, concepts change to suit the people who are using the terms and want to claim that a certain phenomena can be described with their term, mechanism in this case. And I don't mean to just pick on the mechanism folks, but I just know that what a mechanism is in like the William Bechtel sense, and there are parts that do things together that give rise to a function or something. A very, very brief way of saying it. But there are people like you who kind of push back and say, actually, it works differently. But then the mechanists can come back and say, well, now we can incorporate a little bit of what, your problem is with it and sort of redefine what a mechanism is. Yeah. So there's that aspect historically as well. I don't know how you feel about that. Maybe what I wanted to tie it back to is like, well, what is wrong with the idea of motif? I'm not sure what you want to speak to.
No, I mean, so I don't know I haven't read Vicente's work.
He's still working on it. Okay. I mean, it's a work in progress. So if people criticize it, then he can change it.
Right. No, I mean, I'm only working with what you've said. The idea of a concept being interpreted in different ways by a same community strikes me not necessarily as something that is going to be good.
Well, no, maybe not good, but here's an example. A concrete example is the term representation, which I know like philosophically has a shit ton of baggage. And people in the neurosciences, it has plenty of baggage there. Like no one knows what it means. There are lots of fights about it. A term, because Vicente is an ecological psychology person, affordances gets used in different ways, right? By people who want to use it for their own purpose. Yes. And so there's sort of, it's saying like, okay, we don't have to operationally define a term in a very, very narrow way and still make progress.
I think that's, okay. In that sense, I agree. In fact, I think that applies to both the concept of mechanism and the concept of information. I mean, one can make a good case that the reason why information became so irresistible as a notion in the second half of the 20th century was precisely because it was being used in different ways, and we didn't have to tie it all down to one particular concept. I make that case in the book. I talk about the importation of information talk into biology, and I say it happened twice. The first one was a total disaster. The second one was a resounding success. The first one was a disaster because the initial introduction was by means of information theory. And you had people wanting to apply Shannon's notion of information, and then Wiener's notion that he put forward in his book Cybernetics, and Briand as well, his notion of Negentropy. And all of that kind of fails because it leads to theoretical interpretations of biological data that are not taken seriously by anyone. And so those are abandoned. And so the term is then reintroduced in a much more loose way. In fact, reintroduced in the second 1953 paper by Watson and Crick, where they say that it's not escaped our attention that that, well, when they say that there's genetical information, and the term starts to be sort of shorthand to talk about what people used to talk about specificity when they mentioned specificity. And you have people in developmental biology talking about information in one way, people in cell biology talk about the information another way, and these are different, and it seems to be fine because within the people that you're talking to, they know what you mean. It's like a façon de parler way of speaking. Right. The exact same thing I've made the case is true for mechanism. Even better case, the mechanism of protein synthesis. If you try to tie that down to something very specific, it's not going to allow you to understand why the mechanism of natural selection is a mechanism. If you use the definition from molecular biology, its power lies in exactly that it's sort of de-ontologized. It becomes vague in a productive way, right? There are certain expectations perhaps that are common about what the phenomenon is likely to be like if you think of it in terms of a mechanism, but you don't see it defined. It's not a word that comes up in the glossary of textbooks. Mechanism doesn't need to be defined for it to be fruitful. So in that sense, I totally agree with what you're saying.
Well, and it's worse than that because things that are so narrowly defined just stopped being used, right? So they disappear. They don't survive natural selection in the sciences, essentially. Mm-hmm. But if it's vague enough, it'll hang around because people can use the term the way that they want it, and then it becomes popular, and then you start putting it in every abstract that you write. Yeah.
Then the question then is what I was saying in the beginning, which is, is that there is where you may have worries, right, Paul? If it really means different things, there is scope for confusion of people thinking that it can, you overreach, right, with it, and I think that's what happened with information. What's happened with mechanism. Something that is useful in one context does not allow you to make the inference that it's going to be useful for every context, and this transition from something that is useful to something that is truthful, right? I think that's the worry, that just because something is useful doesn't mean that it's telling you what's really going on.
Okay, two more subjects that I want to discuss with you, and any that you also want to highlight or discuss. One is just sort of stepping back, like what lessons, maybe as a scientist, and we don't have to talk about it in such a narrow scope as like a scientific researcher, but I'm wondering what lessons to take from your study here on the Schrödinger historic work. Yeah.
What lessons to take? I think the different lessons depending if you're a biologist or a philosopher or a historian.
What if you're a neuroscientist? Let's say you're a biologist if you're a neuroscientist, kind of, but you deal with more abstract information type processes. Maybe not. I don't know. Let's say
if you're a scientist, then knowing. I think what I'm hoping that the book shows is that the view that you have today about the cell or the brain is not inevitable. You haven't read it off nature. Nature hasn't given you like a truth bulletin, like, this is what the brain is like, or this is what the cell is like.
Nature the magazine or nature?
Reality.
Reality. Yeah. Thank you. Just you haven't read enough Nature. I didn't want to. Yeah.
No. Good that you clarify that. So not the journal, but reality is not telling you how to conceptualize it. It's limited beings like ourselves that are doing our best to make sense of little bits of it. And we are so enmeshed and embedded in those ideas that we sometimes forget that that's just one way of thinking about reality, and that there's nothing inevitable about it. That there's more than one way to look at things, and that the reason why we think about the brain the way that we do, or the cell, is the product of a set of decisions that were made historically, many of them contingent and opportunistic, and were dependent on the technology that was available and who, and the personalities of the authors, that wrote in the most influential way. And so that should give you some freedom to explore other ideas. If you don't feel that you are bound to understand the brain in one particular way, it suggests that that suddenly history becomes relevant, because all the history of people who've said different things doesn't look so naive and so wrong-headed anymore, because what history actually shows. Not only is that what we now think is contingent, but also that we are constantly reinventing the wheel. There's nothing new under the sun. Like, we're constantly rediscovering things that people had said decades, sometimes centuries before. That's why I like history. I mean, I'm a philosopher and I care about the present, about understanding reality.
The problem is it confirms that I have no good ideas because they've already been over and over developed, right? So
that's over. I think we are overrated. The new ideas are overrated. What matters is what you can do with an old idea.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that could be one lesson for the scientists reading this. Okay. This, you look at this book, everybody knows it. And it turns out million different interpretations of it. The book itself is a product of someone wanting to say something in a particular context, right? Helping, if you know that helps you put this into perspective. There's nothing inevitable about the picture of the cell that is being presented in this book, right? So we shouldn't feel too bad if the evidence leads us to move away from that picture. So that could be one lesson that one could do.
I have my own lesson that is related to that, I think. So very specific example, I was watching a talk the other day. I'm not going to mention who it was or what it was about, but their entire talk was was almost based on, it was rife with name dropping, historical people and their ideas. And it was kind of the greatest hits of so-and-so said this and so-and-so said that. And it was meant, so there's this term pseudo-profound bullshit that if you say something, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. If it seems profound, it will be more interpreted as important or correct or something. Yeah. So like in the sciences, when you give a talk, and it's great to reference historical ideas and people, and research, but often I feel often it is done in the service or without much care for whether what you're alluding to actually was the message that was trying to be conveyed, which is exactly what your work speaks to. When you start digging in, that's actually not what they were referring to. Or at the time, it was known that there were other things that were correct, etc. Anyway, when I watch a talk like that, and they're just dropping little nuggets here and there, and I'm automatically very skeptical because it's like they're just using it to bolster their case, to confirm their agenda. Right. And so that's a lesson that I have, is when I see these references to quote unquote important people, you're just trying to like bolster your own import by, in some cases. There's a fine line, I guess, and I don't know where the line is, because it is good to couch things in historical terms, because to highlight what has been known and what has been shown over the years. Anyway, that's a lesson that I've taken.
Yeah, So, we talked about this at the beginning of our conversation, how historians of biology complained about that you had these molecular biologists, Nobel laureates, saying, hey,
but look, Schrödinger said this.
Yeah. That's why we're on the right track, because the great Schrödinger said it first.
Yeah,
that's what annoyed the historians.
There's that idolatry. I hate idolatry in the sciences.
Also, it's just lousy reasoning from a philosophical perspective. You're appealing to authority instead of making a case through.
Well, that's why I hate it. Yeah. But that's how it's used. That's how idolatry is used.
Yeah, exactly. So, why the reason I think this has been a very interesting project. Not my book, not What Is Life, the book by Schrödinger, is that on the one hand, I am. It is not clear. So one of the reviewers, when this was going through peer review, was very confused about whether
your book goes through peer. Oh, I didn't know. Is that specific to elements?
No, I think most monographs undergo peer review.
Oh, okay. Sorry, naive.
No problem. So one of the reviewers like, what are you doing? Are you? It looks like at some points in the book you are saying, you are sort of criticizing Schrödinger really, really heavily. Right. And then later he seems to be a hero for you because you're sort of trying to explain. So what's going on? And it's a fair point, because in some parts of the book, when I look at the book from the contemporary perspective, at the beginning of my book, when I look at What Is Life, how you should read it today, then I'm quite critical, because we've learned so much, as you would expect. 80 years have passed. We've learned a lot, and there are good reasons to be critical of many of the things that Schrödinger said, right? But then later, I am sort of defending Schrödinger in the sense that I'm saying that his ideas were more valuable than people have suggested. I mean, especially these historians, the
Then critics have
the people who've looked
suggested.
at stuff carefully have concluded there is no scientific value in the book because it was only a tool, right? So I'm criticizing those people. In that sense, I'm defending Schrödinger. So the reviewer is saying like, well, it looks like you can't
Pick a side.
But I don't see there's I don't know if that struck you when you were reading it, but that's not.
Yeah.
So that's not what I was. I don't think there's any inconsistency because in the second half, I'm actually trying to take his ideas seriously. I'm saying, well,
but
if you look at what he actually said and the argument. And then you look at what we know about the cell and how what we know was sort of developed in the second half of the 20th century. There's so much continuity that one can make a really good case that that it was influenced. So
I think there's cognitive dissonance because you say it clearly and without apology, where you see that Schrödinger was correct in these things, and you don't spend a lot of time defending that. You just lay out the case and say it.
Yeah, so I would maybe tweak that and say that I show how Schrödinger was influential. I wouldn't use the word correct to refer to truth because the view of the cell that he gave us, I don't think is right. But he was influential. He really was genuinely influential in giving us that picture that I have criticized in my previous work. So, but that is a process of defending Schrödinger, defending his influence, not defending what he says, but the fact that what he said was valuable and was not valuable, was influential, was taken seriously, And then at the end,
it was valuable in that it moved fields forward, maybe in the wrong direction, but in a direction.
Yeah, and also it valuable in that you know what you're dealing with. I mean, you know where it comes from. I mean, what you're dealing with today, if you're a scientist and you don't care about history, you have no interest in history. My book says, well, you should care because the view that you are dealing with now has a history, has a beginning. We know when these ideas came from. So I think it's relevant to know that because it, as I said before, it helps you to remind yourself that it's not inevitable, right? And then, as I say, the final part, the third of the book is trying to work out, why Schrödinger said what he said, and that takes you to physics. I mean, there's a discussion about quantum mechanics and how to interpret quantum mechanics and all of that, and that becomes much more philosophical because then you need to talk about free will and all of that stuff and misrepresentations and personal rivalries. I mean, it's kind of hilarious to read the literature, the letters where they're insulting each other. Schrödinger talks about Copenhagen twaddle and the sham philosophy of Bohr. I mean, really, really hardcore. Heisenberg describes the visual. It talks about Schrödinger as it's crap. He says this is crap what he's doing. Schrödinger complains that the Born is computing the shitty little matrices from my beautiful wave equation. So all that language is in there. It makes it all much more human. That you got personalities and rivalries that are responsible ultimately for the motivations. That led to people saying what they said. You don't see that in the published final product, but if you actually go into the archives, you find out there's all this strong, people being very offended or being moved by emotion in wanting to say what they want to say.
Yeah. Well, how did you? I mean, maybe that's why also your book is a pleasure to read, is because it is a story, and we love story.
Yeah.
So how did you respond to that reviewer? What came of that?
Well, I try to explain that the two things can be true. I am. I mean, it's nuance. I'm sorry. I mean, there are points where I'm being very critical of Schrödinger. I mean, as a scientist, you can be critical. Like, I don't care about this. Just give me these ideas, and as a scientist, I can evaluate them on the basis of the evidence that we have today. That's one task. And then, as a historian, you say, well, where do these ideas come from? And then you can come to a completely different conclusion. You can say, well, I want to defend the influence that Schrödinger had on shaping the ideas that we now take for granted. And that's so why one can be negative in the first and critical in the second. I don't think that's what I try to explain. There's no necessary conflict there.
All right. So when I met you for coffee, you were digging in the archives like you were just describing.
Yeah.
I just kind of want to know more about like what that process is like. I mean, those quotes that you were just rattling off about the shitty matrix stuff, like, were you reading those on the page? And like, so what is that? What is a day like in terms of like what you're doing? It sounds like you're joyfully thumbing through these juicy stories, but that's not most of your time.
Most of it is very tedious. Because you're having to go through a lot of material, and it's It's like looking for, I don't know, if you were in mid-19th century America looking for gold, you have to dig through a lot of dirt to get a little bit of gold. Yeah. It's the same thing. I mean, you have to go through a lot of material to find something that is valuable. Sometimes you see this quoted by other historians. So they have used it for another purpose. Yeah, that's quite nice. So you can use that. But I always like to go to the primary sources because you'd be surprised how often people are misquoted. I don't know if deliberately or accidentally. You can't trust anyone. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm going to have a quote, I want to go to the original archive to find it, make sure that I'm not misrepresenting it, understanding the context in which that quote was, why the person said what they said, right? And it's so different from doing science or doing philosophy. This is like hardcore historical work, and.
It's difficult. It's got to be difficult because you're sitting. You can't. You have to know. Well, where do I look for the thing that is related to what I just found out? And God, it seems like almost impossible.
It is difficult. I actually spent a summer, well, not a whole summer, but several weeks at this place, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which is it's in Long Island, and they have an archive there. And I spent weeks going through the archives of Muller and Brenner, a bunch of people, and I didn't find anything, Paul. Like
So sometimes it is really blank.
I learned a lot about, but I didn't actually find anything there's nothing in my book that I mean, I shouldn't really say this publicly because I was funded to, but that's just how research
you had to know.
Sometimes you just don't find anything. And so I didn't find what I thought I was going to find, which was because I was looking for more examples like Monod of people in the 50s saying, mentioning Schrödinger in the context of the scientific arguments that they were making. I couldn't find that, right?
What does that do to you psychologically when you spend weeks and find nothing?
Well, you just try to convince yourself that you found other interesting things, and that they may become helpful in other projects in the future. I've learned so much about people that I didn't know about. I forced myself to educate myself about things that I didn't know about and people that I didn't know very well. And so that is a sort of arsenal of resources that then you can draw upon later. That's why people say that philosophers age like milk and historians age like wine. Because an old historian is much more valuable than a young historian, because an old historian has so much context that any new piece of information that you give a 30-year-old historian versus a 70-year-old historian, the 70-year-old historian is going to be able to use that new piece of information much more effectively because they can relate it to everything. Whereas if you're young, you don't know enough about everything, right? A historian is constantly developing a more thicker scaffold for the new information. And whereas in philosophy, or mathematics or whatever, if it's all about argument and reasoning, you're going to be brighter when you're younger than when you're in your 70s or your 80s.
So and it's the same process on every turn.
What matters is how quick you can be in working out how you can connect things, working out the logic of it, right? So doing historical work is completely different. But I think what happens, and there's a connection here with science, in the sense that unlike philosophy, so in philosophy you could maybe controversially say that you don't really change your mind. Like you have an idea, you want to defend the idea, and you do your best to defend the idea, right? And then people present you with objections, and then you sharpen your idea even more so that it gets invulnerable to the critique of that person that presented the objection. Whereas in history, it's like it's not up to you. Like if you find evidence in an archive, that may speak against what you have been claiming, and you just have to that just may be a refutation of what you have or you're saying. Like, or thinking about it conversely, it's happened to me. Like I made a claim in a paper, okay, and then a reviewer says this is not true. This is not true. And if it was a philosophical objection, that's really hard to respond because you use it's interminable. But if this was a historical claim that they said was not true, all I had to do is present the evidence. Look at this paper published in this year, shows that what I'm saying is right. End of story.
But in the case of, so that's awesome. But in the case of like your project here, you discovered the why. You believe of why this book was written, but that's something that has to be inferred. There is no evidence for that. You have to abductively infer a reason, right? So I thought you were going to sort of point to that because part of the historical process is like the discovery. Wow, look, you can actually discover
Well,
new things.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that the connection between science and history here is that, and I know this from my limited experience of working in a lab, is that it's also extremely tedious, and often things don't work, and you don't find interesting things. But if you're lucky, maybe once every 10 years, or maybe once in your life, you'll find something, you'll discover empirically something, or you'll come across a result, unexpected, groundbreaking, and the thrill of having that discovery is sufficient to feed you for the rest of your life of disappointments of not discovering anything else. I mean, I haven't had a lifetime of experience in the lab, but I've had people telling me this. I mean, when I was deciding not to continue as a scientist because I found it very tedious, this is what they told me. Like, it will be tedious 99% of the time. But if you're lucky, one day you'll find something that you'll get such a rush from this. It'll be the most pleasurable moment of intellectual pleasure of your life, and it will be enough to sustain you on all those dark days of being, smelling chemicals and rooms with no windows, right? That will sustain you. And one could make a similar case when you're looking at archival documents as a historian.
And yet you persist in history.
You will eventually find, if you hope, something that will. Wow.
You personally, like, so this has happened to you. You've had your moment where it's all been worth it. The 99% of the.
Yeah, I mean, there's a quote that I really like in my book by Darlington, which I think was the closest I've had to this. Darlington is this really well-known British geneticist, and Schrödinger actually has a couple of diagrams in the book from the Darlington textbook, and there's a correspondence with him. I didn't expect to find anything, and it was like Darlington says, funnily enough, he says, I'm so happy that a physicist of your caliber is getting interested in genetics because, I've been having lots of discussions with physicists. This is in the early 1940s, and they're all so obsessed with indeterminacy. Frankly, I find it really annoying. Darlington says. And then Schrödinger responds, thank you for letting me use giving me permission to use this figure. By the way, that quarrel that you have with some physicists, I can assure you is not with me. And then he goes on to say why he's written the book. And I have that in my book because I think that what we need to think about in the case of the cell is determinacy, not indeterminacy. Physicists have thought that we can read out indeterminacy and even a solution to the problem of free will. So all the things that I wanted Schrödinger to say, he literally says those things in the letter. Right. I don't have to make the case. And there's no abductive reasoning here, Paul. Like Schrödinger is saying it, and I can just put that in my. In that way, history is easier than philosophy. In philosophy, you have to make your case, reason for it. In history, if you're lucky enough, you have the person saying what you want them to say. You put that in and that speaks for itself. I mean, you can.
Okay, but modern day, someone can say something, you can have it on video, recorded, and it doesn't matter. Like, you can not mean what you say. You could lie. You could, you can write a letter to be influential and lie, right? And claim something because you think you're getting in someone's good graces. So I'm just saying, like, you're not always being completely truthful.
Right. That's true.
Your
that's a fair point. Maybe, that's right. That's right. Then the question would be, how likely is it, that
right, sure.
being truthful?
So you see, you had to infer a little bit.
I do. I think you're right. I think that's a very subtle, good point objection that you can make. Exactly. It's never the case that a quote speaks for itself. Interpretation is always necessary. But, if Schrödinger is saying, I wrote the book because I was pissed off at these physicists making this case, that's great.
It's good enough for you.
And if you see him saying something similar in other contexts, responding to other people, this is why I went to different archives. I saw him saying similar things to different people. That convergence also gives more evidence that he's being truthful about what he's saying.
That's true. Yeah.
And I found that. So when he speaks to Donner, he's complaining about Bohr. When he speaks to Darlington, he's complaining about Bohr. In another of his books, he complains about Bohr and Jordan. And so I think that I'm quite confident that I've identified the true motivation. It's not one that historians have suggested. This is actually something very novel in what I'm saying. You asked me about the novelty of Schrödinger's book, but not the novelty of my book. So one of the things that you could say that's novel about my book is this new interpretation of why Schrödinger writes about biology. I say there are a bunch of different older hypotheses that he read Darwin as a child, that his father was a botanist, that he was interested in this idea of memory over time that you referred to before, the idea of some sort of what stays fixed over time. And some people have argued that that's what got him interested in genetics. Others that he was a Renaissance man, interested in many different things at different times. But I think that the right, and here we can talk, I think, about right and wrong, that the right primary motivation for Schrödinger, given the historical evidence, some of it unearthed in this process, is that he's responding to physicists with how these physicists have tried to use quantum indeterminacy to take a stance on teleology and cells and ultimately free will, and that is why he ultimately it all boils down to free will. That's why he adds this completely nonsensical epilogue about free will, 5-page long at the end of the book, which has nothing to do with free will. The rest of the book, right? And it's kind of tragic to me that if that's true, it's like tragic to see it 80 years later that no one has picked up on that,
Right.
If it really is the case that is his main motivation, and no one's picked up on it, apart from Darlington, who I have a quote of him, because, Schrödinger explained it to him, and so Darlington says, the organism now has a say in the matter. You can no longer jump from indeterminacy in physics to indeterminacy in psychology. So apart from a few people, most people did not understand the book, and that's kind of tragic because... Oh, but on the other hand, it had a huge influence, so that's a very, very interesting story, I think.
Okay. So last thing here, I promise. So you mentioned during your PhD days, the state, so this is a bit of a left turn, the state of the philosophy of biology was such that everything was being written about evolution. Evolution dominated the state of biological philosophy of biology.
Yep.
What is this? Well, and that was some time ago, and you've said that the tides have turned partly because of work that was going on at your institution. Was it Exeter?
Mm-hmm.
Is that?
Yep.
What is the state of biology these days? What and what resource, if I were going to get the lay of the land, what resource would I look to today?
You mean the state of philosophy of biology?
Yeah. What did I say? Biology?
Yeah.
Yeah, give me the state. Give me the state of biology, Dan. So
another 3-hour podcast. I think that it's in a healthy state because biology is much more than just evolutionary theory, and now philosophy of biology is reflecting more accurately the diversity of interests and questions and problems that one is confronted with in the life sciences. So, good thing.
Is there? Okay, so. Is the reason why it was dominated by evolution then, does that have something to do with the molecular revolution that had something to do with Schrödinger's influence?
It doesn't have, I don't think, anything directly to do with either Schrödinger or molecular biology, but there is a historical story to that too, Paul, and I'm interested in that, and I've written a couple of papers about that, about why it is that philosophy of biology ended up being completely dominated by a very narrow agenda.
It's because the organicists.
It's to do with the people who started doing philosophy of biology in the late 60s and early 70s, who did everything they could to wipe the slate clean, so that the previous organicist tradition was basically removed from the collective memory, right? And so what I was doing actually in Pittsburgh when we talked about was looking at the archives, at the correspondence of one of the founders of modern philosophy of biology, a guy called David Hull. Because the letters are in Pittsburgh. Right. Yeah. And it's super interesting to me to see what he's writing and who he's corresponding with in the 60s and 70s when he's sort of establishing the field that we now know as philosophy of biology. And it's fascinating to see who he read, but then, doesn't mention in publications, but mentions privately, how he has an agenda too, like Schrödinger, like everyone else, in wanting to put forward a very specific particular view of what it means to do philosophy of biology in the right way. His famous paper, actually, just to give you an example of this, the famous paper that he wrote is actually titled "What the Philosophy of Biology Is Not" in 1969. And he's basically saying how one should not do philosophy of biology. And it's kind of hilarious that that's now become a foundational document in my field because it's a review article of previous work. And yet it's a foundational document because it's like, let's wipe the slate clean. Let's start off. We're going to do things seriously. And it's going to be, and because these people, David Hull, Michael Roos, were interested or knew more about evolutionary biology than other areas of biology, those are the areas that then become dominant. And then, they have students, and the students are going to write about and do dissertations on the stuff that they know about from their advisors. And so you've got this perpetuation, this bottleneck, basically, where it takes a very, very long time for philosophers of biology, especially in the US. It's different a bit in Europe. But in the US, in the English-speaking world, in England, Australia, and the US, it's extremely narrowly construed. It's basically philosophy of biology is philosophy of evolution. I mean, there's a textbook from from the early 90s by Elliot Sober, and it's called Philosophy of Biology. You open it up, and it's all about evolution. They don't even realize that they're being narrow. They are using evolution and biology interchangeably. And that wouldn't fly today. If you look at a textbook.
Well, yeah, I mean, you saw like all this opportunity where philosophy was not being done in biology.
Because I had been trained not as a philosopher, learning a little bit about biology on the side, but as a molecular biologist. And so I was interested in conceptual questions. And then I started learning about field bio, and then asking my teachers, where's the stuff on molecular biology? Where's the stuff on developmental biology? Oh, yeah, well, there's one. I mean, things were already getting better by the time, I'm not that old, but if I had been in the 90s, this would have been seriously, there would have been hardly anything for me to draw on. To the extent that there was molecular biology at all, it was in relation to philosophical questions about theory reduction, which are like not interesting to scientists. Can you reduce a theory like Mendelian genetics to molecular genetics? And that's really completely irrelevant to the real questions about reduction that you're confronted with as a scientist. Can you explain a system in terms of its parts without any loss of information? These kinds of questions, which are now, of course, taken seriously by philosophers, were not being taken seriously 30 years ago. I mean, that's why it's so fascinating to open one of these books from the 80s and 70s and see what they think philosophy of biology is. And it kind of explains why most biologists didn't think that was relevant. And so it's a work that had to be done by people before me to open up the agenda so that people talk about immunology, and they talk about biochemistry, they talk about botany, they talk about microbiology, and a lot of that stuff.
You can stop talking only about spandrels.
Only about spandrels and the metaphysics of selection and species and all that stuff, which of course they're important questions, but they're not the only questions. And some of that did happen at Exeter this is why I mentioned it. I mean, the talk that you're referring to was basically a talk that attempt to explain what philosophy of biology was like at Exeter when I started my PhD. It was a kind of commemoration of the 20th anniversary of E. Janis, the place at Exeter, and also the retirement of John Dupre. And so I said in that talk that the stuff I was exposed to there was not being really discussed anywhere in most other places. We're reading stuff that wasn't being discussed in other places because in most other places, the scientific engagement on the part of the philosophers was very narrow. And so today, if you're interested in philosophy of biology, it's a much better position to be in, because you can find books. This Element series is a good example. There are 44 volumes already on all kinds of topics. It's fantastic. You can find if you're interested in all kinds of questions. They're all sort of represented, and so that's a very good sign that the field is in a much more healthy state. But what I find interesting, just to go back to is that you can also tell there's nothing inevitable about that either. People have wanted to make the inevitability case. Don't get me wrong. People have said, well, there's only interesting philosophical questions in evolutionary theory. How can I get excited about the guts of fish? Michael Ruse actually says that. I have a quote from that. How can I get excited about that, about fish anatomy? That's nonsense. I'm interested. So people did think it was inevitable. And I think the historical insight liberates you from that inevitability. It reminds you that you can do, there's a lot, and that's why the organicist stuff is relevant, right? Because these people 2 generations earlier in the interwar period were doing what we would now call philosophy of biology, but they were doing it about development, about the cell, about genes, in a much broader way, ironically than what was happening 50 years later. So we're kind of coming full circle now in that sense.
Well, it's circle, maybe a spiral because it moves forward, right?
Spiral, yeah.
Well, thank you for contributing to the health of the field, and I highly recommend your book and your work. I mean, I've said this before, but I really appreciate the novel and in the Elements style. It's like particularly good because it's not it's not a 2-month long endeavor to get through everything.
No, you can read it in one sitting.
But it does. Yeah, read it in one sitting. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Dan. I hope we keep in touch, and I'm looking forward to your future work as well.
All right. Well, it's my pleasure.
Brain Inspired is powered by The Transmitter, an online publication that aims to deliver useful information, insights, and tools to build bridges across neuroscience and advance research. Visit thetransmitter.org to explore the latest neuroscience news and perspectives written by journalists and scientists. If you value Brain Inspired, support it through Patreon to access full-length episodes, join our Discord community, and even influence who I invite to the podcast. Go to braininspired.co to learn more. The music you hear is a little slow, jazzy blues performed by my friend, Kyle Donovan. Thank you for your support. See you next time.